perfect. In hour 2, we begin talking about the question of reconciliation. The Christian scriptures report the words of Prophet Jesu, "But if anyone has the world's goods and sees his brother in need, yet closes his heart against him, how does God's love abide in him? Little children, let us love not merely in word or deed, in word or talk, but in deed and in truth." Today, this hour, we have to take on the hard question. We seek reconciliation, but at what price? How can the oppressor and the oppressed meet together? When can the oppressed say, "I seek reconciliation with justice"? It's dangerous for the lamb to lie down with the lion, no? That's what we need to struggle with as we talk about the complexity of reconciliation. We have an amazing panel for you now. Eriel, you've met. John Borrows holds the Canada Research Chair in Indigenous Law at the University of Victoria Law School. He's from the Anishinaabe, from the Chippewas of the Nawash First Nation on the shores of Georgian Bay in Ontario. And Professor Payam Akhavan is an international lawyer and professor at McGill University in Montreal. He's a member of the Permanent Court of Arbitration at The Hague. He's also the author of a best-selling book you probably know, In Search of a Better World, A Human Rights Odyssey. And later, Venerable will speak with a translator, but he's going to listen in, and he gets the closing word. I hope you guys can accept that role. Let me start with Eriel and say, what drives you to do what you do? How does your work seek to address the kind of injustices that we've been listening to?
You know, I think that my work really comes from a place of heart, and there was a lot of talk of love and coming from places of love. And for myself as an Indigenous woman, I come from a place of real love for my people and love for my children and love for the future generations and love for my ancestors. And so there's prophecies of 7 generations in Indigenous cosmology, but I want to challenge not just 7 generations ahead, but we have to think of the 7 generations before us. And I take that into consideration when I'm challenging systems of injustice, systems that have been imposed on my people for the previous generations to ensure that the future generations don't have to struggle through the same struggles of my ancestors. So for me, it really comes from a deep place of love and respect for my people and my culture as a Dene Sotlane woman.
Fantastic.
So one of the things that motivates me is the...
You should applaud.
I'm motivated by understanding that law comes from human endeavor and that it's not something that's just handed down from on high, although we can learn from God about what those relationships should be. So I see law as being something that's syncretic, which takes us at this level and tries to reach to a higher level. And so we've created a law degree at the University of Victoria, which is both Indigenous law and common law. It's syncretic, trying to learn about law from the land. And that's the same kind of spiritual practices I think we see on our reserve. We just buried an elder. I was home this past Saturday. We sang Shall We Gather by the River. At the same time, we sang the Spirit Bear song. And so the blending of those traditions to speak to the earth and about the earth and to understand our law from the earth is what really motivates me.
Beautiful. Thank you.
as a law professor, I came to the shocking realization that law and justice are not always the same thing. So much of my work has been focused on eradicating the culture of impunity that exists in international law for crimes against humanity, for genocide. And the stark reality is the chances that you will be punished for stealing a bicycle is greater than the chance that you will be punished for committing genocide. So the establishment of the International Criminal Court in 1998, which was after 40 years of the promise that the Nuremberg Tribunal gave us that international law would punish even heads of state, heads of government, or especially heads of state and government who invariably are responsible for mass atrocities, has been a very long, painful historical process. We now have that institution in The Hague, but it is still weak, fledgling, and at the margins of power realities. And my job is to see how we can transform that into an effective institution with teeth.
The three of you all work with the systemic battle against deep-seated injustices. And if I can just ask you to continue and say, can you describe to us, what does it mean? What are the systems that you fight against? Each of you, you see systematic problems as well as individuals. Help them understand, what is systemic injustice in the area of your work? It's hard to grasp sometimes. It's not like an individual story. Go ahead, please. We'll move backwards the other way, just to keep thinking.
Well, it's one thing to have the right laws. It's another thing to have the institutions that implement them. So we need the right laws, and we need the right institutions to ensure that they're observed. At the end of the Second World War, because of the unprecedented horrors of the Holocaust, human rights, for the first time in history, was universalized. In 1948, we adopted the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, the Convention for the Prevention and Punishment of the Crime of Genocide, but we never created the institutions that can actually implement those laws and bring to justice perpetrators who are not this abstract entity that we call governments. Behind every act of radical evil are powerful people that are making choices. So there is a wide discrepancy between paying lip service to international law and actually making sure that it's implemented. And that's the systemic injustice that we have to confront.
John?
One of the injustices we encounter is that the laws that are guiding us are basically from other places. And we're on Haudenosaunee and Anishinaabe territory, Wendat territory, and there are laws that we've learned about these places over thousands of years. And so it's to bring the standards of judgment and the processes and the institutions that come from this place, that have been learned from this land as people have tried to understand it for many generations, bring that to bears to our standards for decision making as Canadians, and to think about how those laws that are indigenous to these places can guide us in our regulation and our resolution of disputes.
Nice.
I think, to tie that all together is that as someone who's been on the front lines, enacting in acts of civil disobedience, I want to challenge that mentality that these are not acts of civil disobedience, because as an Indigenous woman, I'm upholding the laws of my people. And that we have a real struggle in this world where those that are committing acts of genocide and attacks on the land and Mother Earth and on life itself are not criminalized, and those that are protecting and standing up for life and for the planet are criminalized. We have an imbalance. A lot of the laws that we have to abide by in this country have been made up by those that are perpetrators and some of the most abuses against the people here. And they've been making up laws as long as they've been making up ways to steal our land.
And so when I think about putting the shoe on the other foot, as it were, and understand how we could guide our actions by understanding the earth, I'm taken back to this person we just put into the ground yesterday. He took an eagle feather with him as he was buried. And that eagle feather is significant because it helps us understand that justice is practiced through lifting, through having a sense of vision that would allow us to understand or see that we're all related. When Indigenous peoples gather together, we often say all our relations, or Anishinaabe and Dinue Maganidok. And so the notion is that we are related to the animals, we are related to the rocks, to the sky, to the soil, and those relationships see that there's agency, that there's ability for those beings to be our teachers, our professors, and to guide us in understanding what our, again, standards for judgment will be, our criteria, our authorities.
You know,
Yeah, go ahead. It's
Clap
just
for
a
John.
conversation. You don't need me.
You know, I think one of the really important things is that when we talk about
Ali,
creating
sit there.
institutions for upholding law, we have to ensure that those that have been oppressed and marginalized are not on the outskirts, that we are part of creating, implementing, and enforcing those laws, because we are often the ones that are being oppressed by those very laws. So it's not just important to create the institutions of enforcement of laws, but ensuring that those enforcement procedures, policies, and institutions include the voices of those that are oppressed.
I just want, on an optimistic note, to say that it's remarkable that we're having this conversation, that we're talking about human rights. Gibbons famously wrote in The Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire that history is about the crimes, follies, and misfortunes of mankind. So the fact that today we agree that every human being has an inherent dignity, and that the purpose of civilization and society is to protect that dignity, is phenomenal by the standards of the past, where it was assumed casually that the victor has the right to exterminate and enslave the vanquished. So we are celebrating this year the 70th anniversary of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, and even more recently, the phenomenal Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People that was many years in the making. So while we have many challenges ahead of us, we should also celebrate that at least today we have come to the recognition that injustice is unacceptable. That itself is a revolutionary development.
Mm-hmm. Do you want to add anything? Keep going.
I think my response to that is it's absolutely incredible that we have these pieces of law and protective sort of law, international law. But we have to find ways to ensure that those laws get enforced at the local levels, because regardless of these really great international declarations and conventions, people are still being oppressed. Human rights are still being abused and offended. Here in Canada, we don't think of Canada as a country that is a human rights abuser, but we have been abusing the rights of Indigenous peoples for over 150 years. And we have to find ways of not just putting things on paper, but enacting them. And that comes from really empowering the people to understand their rights at the local level, and for Indigenous people to have recognition of not just who we are as people, but recognition of our lives, our governance systems, and our own laws, which is so important for the work that John does.
And so part of the force of law is what we do inside. How do we internalize those best traditions that come from many parts of the world, including this part of the world? And our notion of law is something that we call Chinaakanagewin, which is to look towards the earth and then take direction from the earth and find ways that can lodge in ourselves. So when force comes from that flow, rather than the coercive elements of jails or fines, although we need those when people aren't following those internalized traditions. But when it comes from within, then we're in a better place to live in peace, friendship, and respect.
I began my...
Yes, you should clap. Come on.
Returning to the theme that my very esteemed colleagues are talking about, I began my career in the UN in the working group on indigenous populations, that it was then, because they wouldn't call them peoples, because peoples have certain rights, populations don't. And it was remarkable to see indigenous peoples from every corner of the world gathered in Geneva, where the UN Human Rights Office is, and bridging the global and the local, exactly what you're talking about. But at the end of the day, I think we need to understand that beyond having the right laws and institutions, we need to have the social forces that ensure that we speak truth to power and that those laws are realized, which is why it is misleading to speak only in terms of laws and institutions, and then to surrender responsibility for our own choices and our own decisions at the grassroots.
We only have a minute left. That was a beautiful conversation that was random, that wasn't scripted. And I'd like to ask each of you to close with your thought about this hard question. When is reconciliation possible with justice? And when does there need to be a no? Can we just start with Payam and let each of you say, the question's reconciliation, you work on human rights. When's the yes? When's the no? When's it possible? We're spiritual and religious people. We fight for reconciliation, but you know injustice deeply in your work. What would you say?
In 30 seconds.
It's terribly hard.
I think forgiveness is a personal choice, and justice is an institutional necessity for social order. But in the context of reconciliation, especially with our indigenous peoples in Canada, we have to realize reconciliation is a two-way conversation, and one side has been at the receiving end for too long. So we need to learn how to listen better, and that will help reconciliation.
I think that reconciliation with one another will come when we're reconciled with the earth. And so understanding that relationship of reconciliation that's required to live peacefully with the beauty that surrounds us physically will then enable us to be reconciled to one another.
He took the words out of my mouth, but I think what I would add to that is that, you know, we can't look at reconciliation as the final product of what we're trying to achieve. Reconciliation is the first step to healing and to really having true justice, not just with one another, but with the planet. And as someone who works in climate justice, we must achieve that first step of reconciling the wrongs that have been done so that we can take steps towards healing, so that we can take steps towards building a balanced future for everybody.
Fantastic. Stay there. Incredible discussion that happens among three leading figures in human rights and justice. It's our privilege to have with us the Venerable Pomnyun Sunim, one of the most active Buddhist leaders in Korea. Venerable is the founder and chair of an international relief agency, the Join Together Society, a center for peace, human rights, and refugees called Good Friends in Korean, a think tank, the Peace Foundation, and an environmental movement organization, Eco Buddha. So please welcome him for some closing thoughts on this topic.
감사합니다. 세 분 얘기 잘 들었습니다.
So thank you for your great conversation.
제가 세 분 얘기를 종합하기는 제 능력상 어려운 일이고요. 세 분 얘기를 종합하는 것은 제가 어려운 얘기고요.
It's very difficult for me to summarize what you just said.
제 경험을 토대로 잠깐 말씀드리겠습니다.
So I want to just share an experience of mine.
저는 한국에서 사람 사이의 갈등이나 인생살이에서 괴로운 것이 있으면 대화를 통해서 해소해주는 그런 역할을 주로 하고 있습니다.
I mostly work in engaging with people and through conversations and dialogues, help them heal themselves.
그런데 제가 사회에 참여한 것은 한 계기가 있었습니다.
However, there was an experience that triggered me to get more involved in social justice.
제가 중국에 가서 북한 국경 지역을 여행한 적이 있었습니다.
So I once visited the boundary between China and North Korea.
그때 안내자가 북한 주민들이 많은 사람이 굶어 죽고 있다고 얘기했습니다.
So at that time, the guide told me that a lot of people in North Korea were starving to death.
저는 그걸 믿지 못했습니다.
I did not believe him.
그러니까 그는 나를 배에 태워서 강가로 가서 북한 국경 가까이에 데리고 갔습니다.
So he put me on a boat and took me to a river right next to the boundary between the two countries.
저는 거기서 굶주리는 아이들을 보았습니다.
Then I saw kids, North Korean kids, starving to death.
정말 고통이 있었습니다.
There was great suffering and pain.
저는 그걸 몰랐습니다.
I did not realize it until then.
독재, 미사일, 핵 이런 것 때문에 그곳에 2,500만 명이 사람이 살고 있다는 것을 잊고 있었습니다.
I was blinded by news about nukes, missiles, and all those threats, and forgot to see that there were 25 million people actually living in North Korea.
그래서 저는 눈물을 흘리면서
So I shed a tear,
그 아이들에게 빵을 주려고 했습니다.
and in tear, I wanted to share pieces of bread I had with those kids.
그러니까 안내자가 막았습니다.
And the guy said, no,
이것은 국경이라서 안 된다고 했습니다.
this is a national boundary. You can't go across.
그때 저는 굶주리는 사람을 돕는데 왜 국가와 국경이 장애가 되는지 큰 의문이 들었습니다.
So that's when I started asking, what good is the nation or the boundaries between nations if it prevents me from helping starving children?
저는 한국에 돌아와서 북한의 인도적 지원 활동을 시작했습니다.
So when I came back to South Korea, I started a humanitarian movement towards North Korea.
많은 사람들의 반대에 부딪혔습니다.
So there was a lot of resistance.
그들은 우리의 적인데 적을 왜 돕느냐는 것이었습니다.
So South Koreans said, North Korea is our enemy. Why help the enemy?
심지어는 우리가 준 살이 총알이 되어 돌아온다고까지 반론을
They
제기했습니다.
said the rice you give them today will come back to us as bullets.
한국 사람들은 그들에 대해서 그들의 고통을 알지 못했고 그들을 이해하지도 못했기 때문에 지원을 행동할 수 없었습니다.
So South Koreans did not understand their pain, did not want to understand their pain, so we could not translate that into action.
중국 쪽으로 국경변에 많은 북한 난민들이 발생했습니다.
So at that time, there were a lot of North Korean refugees starving and crossing the river to China.
저는 그들을 도왔습니다.
I helped them,
여기 또 반대가 발생했습니다.
but there was resistance there also.
북한 정부와 중국 정부가 반대했습니다.
The North Korean regime and the Chinese government opposed this.
북한 정부는 그들은 조국을 배신한 자들이라고 중국 정부는 불법 입국자라고 반대했습니다.
So North Korean regime accused the refugees of being traitors to their own country. Chinese government accused the refugees of being illegal migrants.
그들 또한 북한 주민들을 이해하지 못했습니다.
Neither of them understood the pains of the North Korean refugees.
그 이후에 제가 세계 곳곳에 그 어려운 곳에 가봤는데 모든 곳에는 다 적대 관계가 있었습니다.
So when I actually traveled afterwards to those places of pain and suffering throughout the world, I saw that politics was involved in everyone.
이 적대 관계가 해소되지 않는 한은 인도적 지원도 인권 개선도 평화도 오기가 어려웠습니다.
So unless you resolve that political animosity, you couldn't really treat the human rights, the humanitarian aid.
그래서 평화를 위한 활동을 하게 됐습니다.
That's why I engaged in a peace activism.
굶주리는 아이들에게는 빵이 정의였습니다.
To the starving child, bread was justice.
병든 사람에게는 약이
To
정의였습니다.
the sick and diseased, medicine was justice.
난민들에게는 피난처가 정의였습니다.
To the refugees, shelter was justice.
억압받는 사람들에게는 차별받는 사람들에게는 차별의 철폐가 정의였습니다.
To the oppressed and ostracized, a simple, warm hug of acceptance was justice.
이런 고통은 먼 미래에 해결될 것이 아니라 지금 당장 해결될 일이었습니다.
This is not something to be solved far into the future. It's something to be solved today.
그렇기 때문에 행동하지 않는 정의는 공허한 말장난에 불과하다는 생각이 들었습니다.
So justice without action was just a word.
화해가 없는 평화는 위선이며 이해가 없는 사랑은 폭력에 불과하다는 걸 알게 됐습니다.
I realized that peace without reconciliation is hypocrisy,
네,
and love without empathy and understanding is violence.
제 얘기를 할 수 있게 돼서 감사합니다.
And thank you for the opportunity to speak.